We're waiting just for a couple more minutes for some latecomers to join us, but it's really great. We've got a lot of people already online listening. But if you can just bear with us for another 30 seconds or so. All right. Well, we've hit 4:03, so I think we might get going. I'm Sue Matthews, and I'm just going to do an introduction and give you a bit of background on this event and some of the ones that have preceded it. So I'll just run through how the afternoon's going to go. After I've spoken, I'll be handing over to John Connor, who's the CEO of the Climate Institute. John's going to talk to us about his experience of COP22 at Marrakesh, and particularly about the Faith Foundations and Finance event that he took part in there, which was extremely relevant. After John, Max Horster, who's a partner at the South Pole Group, and he's speaking to us from Switzerland very early in the morning, he'll speak also about the COP that's just finished in Marrakesh and give us some background on some international case study. After Max, we'll hear from Louise O'Halloran. Louise is the Sydney Manager and Wealth Specialist at the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network, and together with Rebecca Wright, who more than anyone has pulled all of this together, Lou developed these guides to divesting and investing, and she's going to talk to us about the guides themselves. After Lou, we'll hear from Katie Young, who's Investment Director of the RS Group in Hong Kong, and she'll talk about the case study that she contributed to the guide, the philanthropy guide, and tell us a bit about the situation with divesting and investing in Asia. We're hoping then to hear from John McKinnon about a case study of a faith group and foundation working together. And after John, we will hear from Thea Ormerod, who's from the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. And Thea's going to tell us about the recent interfaith statement on climate change and about why the guide for faith groups is really important for that sector. And finally, we'll hear from Warren Bird, who is the Head of Treasury and Investment at United Faith Services, and he'll outline their experience of going through this process and the case study that was contributed by them to the guide. So that's a long list to get through in an hour, and we'll be passing from one speaker to the next without an introductory break. And we're hoping that we'll get questions for all the speakers, and we're going to have questions at the conclusion of each speaker. So if you have a question, we need you to, or we'd like you to, type your question into the chat box that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. We aren't able to take voice questions, but the speakers will be watching for any questions in their chat boxes, so please feel free to ask questions as we go. We'll be recording this session, so if you have any problems, you can always tune in later and listen. So just to give you a bit of background, I am a trustee of the Mullum Trust, which is a small environmental foundation, and I'm on the board of the AEGN, the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. And back in September of 2015, I was at an environmental philanthropy conference in the US, and I met up with the leaders of the American Divest Invest philanthropy movement. That's Ellen Dorsey, who is an absolute firebrand leader, and Clara Vondrich, who is coordinating the American Divest Invest philanthropy movement. And in that conversation we came up with the idea of what we could do in Australia. We could bring together not just philanthropists but all sectors whose purpose and role is to try and make the world a better place. Because the challenge of climate change has really brought into very sharp relief the importance of aligning our values with our investments, putting our money where our mouths and our commitments are. So this led to the AEGN working with the Climate Institute, who one of Australia's leading climate policy NGOs, to present a conference in Sydney, which that happened last April this year. And we were extremely lucky to be able to invite Stephen Heinz, who's the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, as our keynote speaker, and you can see Stephen speaking there on the screen. His speech was an extremely helpful description of the process that Rockefeller Brothers had gone through to firstly decide to divest from fossil fuels. That took them a long time. It wasn't done overnight, to convince their board and so on. And then to reinvest those funds in climate-friendly technologies and activities. And Stephen really did provide inspiration for everyone who was there. And if you weren't lucky enough to be there, you can find an interview with Stephen Heinz on the AEGN website, which is www.aegn.org.au, and I think we'll have a screen at the end with that in it. And of course, Rockefeller Brothers, that decision that they made headlines. It made headlines even in Australia, in the Financial Review and the business pages, because they're a big fund, and it was a big announcement. And it was really the core of the announcement that was made at what was it called, Climate Day in 2014, that huge march in New York that coincided with the UN meeting then. And in a few hours, probably I think sometime after midnight Australian time, in New York, the 2016 version of that announcement is due to be made, and we'll get the international numbers for the current totals of divestment and investment. Now that's actually embargoed, but we are lucky to have a little bit of advance information, and we can tell you that the numbers have almost doubled since September last year, and we're looking at more than $5 trillion now under management that are committed to divesting from fossil fuels. And what I think is really beginning to change quite profoundly is that it's not just, these are not just decisions made out of principle, but because people are really concerned about reputational risk, financial risks and legal risks. I think there's been a lot of research on fiduciary duty, which has really influenced a lot of people to actually make these moves. And so that's why we've developed these guides, which we will be hearing about a bit later. But right now I'm going to hand over to John Connor from the Climate Institute.
Thank you, Sue. Can you hear me there? I presume you can.
Yes.
Yeah, great, wonderful, okay. So yes, John Connor, CEO of the Climate Institute here in Australia. And look, this is a wonderful moment because it's a culmination of a range of things that we've done for many years. We have been involved in the investment space and tracking the big managers of funds, the superannuation pension funds, since 2007. We have also been involved with the faith community from then, and even just in 2006 did one of the first multi-faith statements of climate change called Common Belief, which continues to be one of our most downloaded documents, and worked with Thea and others to help set up the Australian religious response to climate change as a key moral voice, particularly at a time of conservative political leadership. The other thing that we have done is always track the international climate negotiations. This is a global problem which does need global solutions, and so for that reason I was in Marrakesh, the annual climate summit, and of course was there when some of the momentous events of the presidential election came through, and we had a couple of days where it was Hug an American Day, with some of the surprise, shock and even grief amongst some about what does that mean for climate action. I think the exciting thing and the interfaith statement was part of a range of responses which really showed that we have a far more resilient system now than even, say, 12 months ago, when if this had happened in the run-up to the actual agreement of this universal framework, which is driven by nations and their individual commitments, it would have had a lot more impact. The other thing that is important and was brought home at a number of investor meetings in Marrakesh was that we're also now seeing this shift and architecture and tools are really developing that is directing capital in this way. So it's not just the explosion of the global of green bonds and climate bonds. We're seeing low carbon registers. We're seeing far greater focus on disclosure, and we'll hear in a couple of days where the Financial Stability Board is, for example, in that regard in terms of disclosure. And we're seeing the actual investment stats globally, where investment in clean energy already outstripping fossil fuel investments. But I think we will have some impact, and the national commitments are still not enough, even if we'd had a different result in the US presidential election. And so continued pressure, continued exposure, and continued focus from a range of communities is important. And I was fortunate enough to go to a couple of events in Marrakesh where interfaith and faith communities were really stepping forward and talking about some exciting developments there. So they did publish an interfaith climate change statement to world leaders, which is calling on them to take much stronger action. But we also heard about the actions that the various faiths themselves were doing, and I recommend you follow up on some of the work that's being done and the work of, for example, Reverend Fletcher Harper, who's the Executive Director of Green Faith. But we also heard, for example, from Imam Safet Katovic, who's the Chairman of Green Muslims in New Jersey. They're launching the first ever Muslim statement around climate change and responsibility. So quite a broad spread there of the faiths themselves engaging and committing on that. And we also saw a fascinating collection of essays there for those who wanted to dig deeper in this, of interfaith essays on energy ethics. So Dr. Erin Viviano launched Light for a New Day, a collection of essays there in that regard as well. So, and of course, we also had those from the financial community, like Mark Campanale from the Carbon Tracker Initiative, talking about both the tools that are growing in their capacity, but also the focus that comes from these sorts of initiatives. And so I'd be, I'm excited to hear now, as a result of the work that we've done collectively with the guides being launched, and those that speak to that. But I'm happy really to hand over to those who are doing more on that, unless we have any questions. I'm looking on the panel there, which is not there, so it's actually over to the people who are now chatting too. So I think it's over to Max from South Pole. So thank you for facilitating and providing the platform for this webinar, Max.
Thank you very much, John. I hope everyone can hear me now, and I would ask Rob to change slides on my behalf. So my name is Maximilian Horster. I'm a partner at the South Pole Group. And Rob, if you could go to the first slide. We are, as an organization, a leading specialist to measure climate change. We basically do two things. We measure climate impact for around 1,000 clients, organizations, agencies, and so on, and we help reduce climate impact. We do that with 150 colleagues in 17 offices around the world. In Australia, we have an office in Sydney and in Melbourne. I'm calling in from Switzerland, so it's indeed quite early here, but I hope I will be able to keep the good energy level. in Australia, you might have come across us also as we partner with the Australian Responsible Investment Advisor CARE. So we measure climate impact since about 6 years also for investors, and what you see at the bottom right of the slide is that we have so far screened $2 trillion of assets under management for their climate impact. When we started 6 years ago, and most of these assets we screened really in the last year and a half, 2 years. When we started this 6 years ago, most of our clients were actually in the faith-based investor and foundation space, so very much in the space of the people who are on this call right now. And so what I think a lot of people don't realize and aren't aware of is that the fact that investors are now measuring the climate impact of their investments, and when I mean investors, I mean large institutional investors are measuring their climate impact, that is actually an achievement that comes from the faith-based community and foundation space, namely of the spirit of those who have done that already early on. So to give you an example here from the international space, the Church of Sweden, a good 6 years ago, had first published their investment carbon footprint, so the greenhouse gas emissions that they are exposed to through their investments. They did that because they felt that, similar to what Sue said at the outset of this webinar, that they needed to align the way they invest their money with their mission. And so they measured their climate impact as part of the first step of divestment. They put it out there, and it was the Swedish Minister of Financial Markets who saw that and who picked it up and then basically said, look, said to the Swedish institutional investor space, namely the pension funds, the AP funds, I want you to measure and report your climate impact. It can be done because the Church of Sweden has shown how it can be done. And so with that, the AP funds, the Swedish pension plans, large Swedish pension plans, started to publish their carbon footprint. They were basically at the front of two international initiatives, one called the Montreal Carbon Pledge, and one is the Portfolio Decarbonization Coalition. So two investor initiatives that created transparency about climate impact and set themselves targets to reduce it with means such as divesting. And especially the Montreal Carbon Pledge might be known to you because it has a very large amount of Australian investors as part of it. And so by the time that the COP21 happened in Paris last year, a range of investors already did know how to measure climate impact, had done the first step, and this group of investors was actually quite loud and present in Paris at the COP21, saying we investors have to take our part in this and do our bit. If you could change the slide, please. And so now that we are 1 year on, and John just mentioned that you returned from Marrakesh, we are at a very special situation. The world has committed to reduce global warming to below 2 degrees, as you know, and the Marrakesh COP was seen by my colleagues who attended as what they coined a hangover COP in the sense that people came together again, the states came together again and said, oh, what have we done? We now have to actually act on what we have agreed last year. And they were all surprised by how fast the Paris targets were ratified. As you know, the ratification happened shortly before this COP in Marrakesh. So that means we are now at a very unique point in time where countries have agreed to limit global warming to below 2 degrees versus pre-industrial levels, and that means that we will see huge shifts out there. Companies will have to transform, industries will have to transform, societies might have to transform, and that of course puts investors into the situation to ask, do my investments still make sense in such a 2-degree world? Where are the next big risks that come with that, and where are the opportunities? And just on the risk side, as you know, climate risks are typically divided into physical risks. So am I invested in assets that are exposed to extreme weather events, to droughts, floods, and so on, and into transitional risks, meaning risks that come with change in legislation and regulation. And it's currently that most investors are focusing on the transitional risks, not so much the physical risk, because the physical risks are 20 years out, 25 years out, while investment horizons are more 2-3 years. And so now the focus is really on the transitional risks. And if you could change the slide, please. When you look at where we stand with these transitional risks, which basically means that regulators will step in, you can observe that we are currently at a point in time where countries are taking stock. So you have countries out there who have, you see that on this X and Y axis, who have a more or less high understanding of climate risks and climate impact and a way to standardize reporting. And you have now countries like France and Sweden on the upright where investors have to report their climate impact. Same with California. And so this is very much an achievement that has been started by first movers in the financial space, and those were faith-based investors and foundations who early on aligned their mission with the way they invested their money, and then it was picked up by mainstream investors who realized that climate change means risk for their investments. So if you could go to the next 3 slides, one by one, they give you examples of where these investors stand now. So you see the Church of Sweden here. As mentioned, they were early on in disclosing about their climate impact, and now they're again leading the way in divesting. They're part of the divestment community, as you know, but their divestment goes quite far, including also gas, for example. If you go to the next slide, and participants will get those slides, so you can read on this later on. You see Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, UK-based, faith-based investor and foundation from the Quaker community. And as you see here in the statement at the bottom, for them divestment, similar to the Church of Sweden, is not so much about divestment for the sake of it, but actually investing in companies that offer solutions to climate change. And maybe we skip, in the interest of time, over the next case a study. You can read on it when you go through the slides. That's the known one of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So to summarize, we are at a point in time where, from my point of view, it is again a great moment for faith-based investors and foundations to lead the way and to say not only that we create transparency, we also act upon the understanding that we have. That is still lacking out there. So you have a lot of institutional investors who now show what their climate impact is, but they don't necessarily act upon yet. So this is something where I think you can lead the way. How you can get started is with screening tools. They are online available. Some of them are for free. You upload your portfolio in, for example, this one of those that I mentioned here, usri.com, and you download a climate impact report so you understand what your climate impact is of your investments. And if you move on to my last slide, in a second step, you can act upon this, meaning you can choose to obviously optimize your portfolio around the topic of climate change, and that is, goes from divesting. You see that on the left-hand side. You divest from companies that have fossil fuel reserves, or you divest from companies that have a large carbon footprint, which is not necessarily the same. One is the supplier of fossil fuels, the other one is the consumer of fossil fuels. And then you can proactively invest in companies that lead the way, that are climate leaders, that are developing solutions to the topic of climate change and so on, all the way to the right where you invest compliant with the world's 2-degree target. Let me finish here, and if there are no questions, let me hand over to Lou O'Halloran from the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network.
Thank you, Max. Were there any questions, Max? No? Let me begin then. It's very nice to be here, and I have to say that it's been quite a journey towards publishing these guides, and we're thrilled that only just today I think we've finally put them up on the website and they're available. They're the product of about a year's work, I would say, from the inception of the Divest Invest conference that came about that Sue was talking about to what's going on in April. And the context for this guide is that it's published by the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network, and we're a group of about over 100 foundations, trusts, individual philanthropists with a focus on environmental giving. And what they're concerned about is to maximise their impact. And so several years ago we began a dialogue with our members, and they with us, about how to take the journey of using their corpus as well as their grant making skills and resources and assets to change the tide, you know, to create the highest leverage that they possibly could. And so it made a lot of sense when Sue suggested that we be part of developing a Divest Invest conference and movement in Australia, that AEGM will be a part of that. And these guides sit in that context, and I think that what we also wanted to do was bring to the table something that perhaps hadn't been done yet. There's a wealth of information that's been developed over the last few years, some amazing publications. There's Arabella and there's the Divest Invest work, and there's just so many great things around the South Pole tool. There's other mechanisms that people can employ. But I think in all of our development of the conference and bringing the speakers together and getting the audience there, what we found most people were saying was, it's all very nice to say, do it, and we'd say, look, there's many different ways that you can do it, and you've just got to choose the best way that's for you. But people are saying, but we don't even know where to start to look at all the choices. And so we found it was important not only to take people on a step-by-step journey through how you work with your investment committees and your advisors and maybe your asset consultants, but also what are the examples that are around, who's done this, and what have their policy statements said, and what is the range, and how varied can this be? Because a lot of people saw it as quite black and white. So I'll just go through what's in these guides as a quick overview. We've only got a few minutes. So the guide has ended up being about 40 pages, so it's quite substantial. We start with the investment landscape, which I'm going to go into in a bit more detail in a moment, but that gives you about 25 policy statements from divesting organisations around the world, and also a lot of them are from Australia as well. But they give you a snapshot in like a sentence about the kind of angles people have chosen. So this demystifies for people what the divestment process could look like for them. We then go into some background about how the movement began, where it's at now. We look at the investment landscape. AEGM members have also been on a journey to look at how their corpuses can be invested in new environmental markets here in Australia. And anywhere between 2 and 6 months is my understanding from those who have gone through the process. And we end with 2 case studies, one from the RS group and one from the English Family Foundation from Australia. And we're going to be hearing from Katie next from the RS group. And then we have pulled together some appendices which give people a snapshot of the actual fossil fuel companies that we're talking about, what their weighting is in certain indexes, and their choices in how far they want to go with divestment, whether they want to go a small but very direct route, or whether they want to go broadly based. And it helps again to demystify what we mean when we say divestment. So with that, I'd like to just refer to the slide 1, be the change you want to be, which is really what Sue was saying, which is this is what's motivating most of the members of AEGN and other like-minded foundations and philanthropists who wish to enact what they do in that with their grant making. So Rob, can we please go to the next slide? I just wanted to show you here some of the methodologies of which I speak. Rob, can you hear me? I can't move the slide.
Okay.
Oh no, that's the 3rd slide. If you could go back one, hopefully. No? No, okay, my 2nd slide's fallen out. That's okay. I just wanted to read to you some of these methodologies because we did spend a lot of time trying to gather ones that would be really illustrative for people. So let me read out, for instance, the Wallace Foundation Fund will avoid investments in companies that play key roles in the exploration, production and retailing of fossil fuels, especially coal. So it shows you there that somebody's taken a special focus on coal. The Rockefeller Brothers Foundation Fund pledged to a two-step process to address its desire to divest from investments in fossil fuels with immediate focus on coal and tar sands. The City of Melbourne commits to not directly investing in any fossil fuel or fossil fuel aligned companies in the future, and it requests management to write to the trustees of Council's default superannuation fund, Vision Super, and request a fossil-free investment option be available to its members. There's many others of those which get more granular into specifics of the number of years that they want to do it within, and there's methodologies there on full divestment as well as partial divestment, and also on the investment side, so policies and methodologies around investment. Okay, so the investment opportunity area, we didn't go into a step-by-step process for this because this guide is mainly about divestment. But what we've done with the investment side is to look at the opportunities and to show, I suppose, also directed at investment committees and boards and management, that the landscape for investing in environmental markets has changed. And even though we don't feel that so much in Australia, we are very, very behind here. But with the rest of the world moving, things are going to pick up pace here very quickly. And it basically tries to explain the levelised cost of energy and how we turned a big corner in 2014, and we now have more installed capacity going in for renewables than oil, gas and coal put together. So we try and develop the landscape there to give people a positive view on the potential for investment in environmental markets, bearing in mind the enormous level of uncertainty and the difficulty in Australia, but that things are changing rapidly. So the guidelines, we go through a 5-step process. How much time do I have left? Sorry. Okay, next slide please, Rob.
You've got a few minutes, Lou.
Okay. So the 5 steps that we take people through, the first step is probably the most time consuming, and when we look at people's hesitation perhaps in going through the divestment process, partly it's to do with they think that it's going to be a really onerous, large, difficult pathway. And I hope that we've made that pathway a lot clearer and easier. And what we've done in the research section is to bring together 5 or 6 questions that the organisation will need to go through. And the tools, we think the very best tools that are around for people to capture so that they can bring their boards and their investment committees along for the journey with them. So those questions include, just a moment, please, one moment please. Are we up to date with the latest research on climate change and climate investment? And we've got about 5 seminal papers there. What kind of training is available? So we lead people to, there's a couple of training videos around that investment committees and boards and management can sit together and watch, so it becomes like a workshop environment. How can we analyse our portfolio's carbon footprint? So we have a couple of really good tools there that people can access quickly. What is our fiduciary duty in relation to taking these steps towards divest and invest? And we've highlighted there the latest and the best publications that have been released about fiduciary obligations and legal obligations. Can our current fund managers and advisors help us with this? And so we list 7 questions that one can put to one's current advisors and fund managers just to clarify the issue so that it's not hazy and you know where they stand and what they can do for you and at what price. If our current advisors and managers can't help us, where do we find alternatives? So we've turned to some suggestions there on how you can research the landscape for where you actually would find people who could help you transition. Which foundations are already divesting, because it's always good to know what your peers are doing and how they're doing it, and what other expertise and information is available. So once you've collected, I think the point is that you've really got to do that research first to know then how this fits into your organisation's values and mission and whether there's alignment and how you create that argument for your outside stakeholders. So the next step is divestment right for us? And that takes you through a workshop process where you look at your own mission, your own investment policy as it stands, whether those things are related and how you bring those things together with what you know already about climate change, investment and risk and all of that you've gone through in step 1. Step 3 is a step-by-step guide on how to create a solid policy. So you're working your way towards implementation. Step 4 is the action and the implementation stage and who you appoint to take on certain tasks and goals and reaching goals. And step 5 is reporting and reviewing. So I think, have I got it? What's the next slide? Rob, will you please move to the next slide? As I mentioned earlier, the publication ends with a couple of case studies, which people always love because they show, you know, all of the kind of vulnerabilities and uncertainties and how people, you know, thought it through and who they engaged. And that one's the RS group, which we're going to hear from Katie in a moment. And we've also got the English Family Foundation. And then the final part of the guide is a directory of Australian organisations and where they fit in our ASX 300 index, their weightings and the various tiers and the names of the organisations that will be that one would consider. So that again is for investment committees so that they can actually see the companies that you're talking about and what sectors they fall into. And there's also a global view for global equity portfolios on the carbon underground and which aspects of those relate to Australia and more broadly. So I think that's all that I could probably describe about that's the philanthropist guide, and Thea later on is going to talk about the faith-based guide, which has been adapted directly from the Foundation's guide. And I'd just like to close by saying you can find that guide right now on divestinvest.org.au. And the other important thing that I'd like to close on is that we created these as a template, and we created the Foundations one first, and then Rebecca immediately got to work and sort of plugged and pasted and made it into the faith-based publication, which includes slightly different case studies and examples and things like that. But the framework is there, and I would like to encourage people from other jurisdictions and also other sectors, such as, you know, local councils and super funds and unions to look at these guides and see how you would like to use them in other places and for other areas, because we're really happy to share, and I think a lot of work's gone into this, and it's been reviewed by Mercer and South Pole and Divest Invest, and we feel it's a really top shelf publication. So if you'd like to sort of fly on the back of that and call us and let us know if you'd like to use it, we'd be most happy to share. Okay, thank you very much. And are there any questions? Yes, there's a couple of questions. No? No questions? Okay, well, I'd like to hand over now to Katie Jung from RS Group, and to thank you, Katie, for putting all that work into that beautiful case study for the publication.
Thank you, Lou. We're very honored to be part of this initiative. I'll start by giving everyone a bit of a picture of who RS Group is, and then move on to what we've covered a little bit in the case study in terms of the process of implementing our Divest Invest strategy. So maybe moving on to our first slide. Maybe Rob, you can help us do that. Okay, great. So RS Group is a Hong Kong-based family office founded by our principal, Annie Chen, in 2008. As a team, she's supported by a local group here, 3 or 4 of us in Hong Kong, and we also work with some external advisors based in the US and Switzerland. So what exactly do we do at RS Group? We do a range of activities, ranging from investments, philanthropy, and advocacy work, broadly surrounding the visions towards developing a sustainable economy. The tagline that we have is investing in the future we want to create. What this means is that very dear to us and that we care a lot about. At the same time, we're fully aware that capital, aside from generating financial return, it has the propensity to create or destroy social and environmental value for the wider society. So in 2013, we decided to deepen our focus on climate change mitigation and adaptation in the portfolio. And Divest Invest, the decision was core to this strategy. So moving on to the next slide. I will talk a bit about the process of how this happened. Roughly around 3 steps: assessment, the Divest Invest action, and the ongoing engagement. In 2013, we were informed by the research by a carbon tracker on unburnable carbon and stranded asset risks. So on the philanthropy side, we decided to fund a piece of report that's called the Great Coal Cap, working with Carbon Tracker, which focused on the stranded asset risks in the thermal coal companies in the China context. So with the benefit of this knowledge, we decided to assess the exposure in our portfolio in terms of our coal, oil, and gas sector holdings. Thankfully, because a lot of the managers that we have invested in apply a sustainable lens, so a lot of them have naturally, as part of their negative and positive screening, not heavily invested in this sector. So our main holdings was actually in an equity passive tracker. So moving on to the next stage, we divested from this equity tracker and we started looking out for opportunities to redeploy these proceeds into a range of climate change solutions that are across different asset classes. Here we've listed a few. In the listed equity space, we invested in a fund manager called Impacts. In the private equity space, we invested in SJF Ventures that provides capital to US-based companies that are addressing climate change in recycling and renewable and different IoT technologies. And finally, in the impact space, we invested in a fund called Althelia Climate Fund that prevents deforestation by creating revenue streams around carbon credits and also providing livelihood to the local indigenous communities in terms of growing their crops like cocoa and so on. So after these investments, we also went on to refine our investment policy statement, specifically creating a different section that provided guidance around our future stance on fossil fuel investments. And the details around that policy statement can be found in the case study itself. The last pillar is really the ongoing engagement, which is really very important to us. After we've divested and invested in new solutions, we also decided to sign on to the Divest Invest pledge and became a signatory in 2015. And now we're part of this community, and it's helpful for us to receive the ongoing developments and trends in this community and initiative. Second of all, we also communicated this decision to all our fund managers and also urged them to factor in climate change risks, and most of them already have done so. So this is really about creating an open dialogue with them to reinforce our concerns as an investor. And finally, in June this year, we published an impact report, which is downloadable on our website, that details basically everything that we have done in RS Group in terms of our investment and philanthropy work, our journey, our thesis, and also we've put in case studies around how we address climate change as well. Last point is we've been asked to comment a little bit about the status in Asia. Now I have to caveat by saying that we're by no means an expert, so from what we've observed in terms of the Divest Invest movement, the leaders are really in Australia for now, and perhaps there's a bit of momentum going on in Japan. As far as we can tell in Hong Kong, we're not aware of investors or foundations or family offices that have gone as far as RS Group has, at least being very public about divestment in fossil fuels. Having said that, there are a group of local grassroots organizations and individuals that are championing this message. And they promote that through, I think, writing on newspaper columns and social media. I think part of the bottleneck here is in Hong Kong there's a lack of leadership for large institutional investors that have taken on this big step, and I think this is a very important way to create that momentum as we've seen in Australia, Japan, and other markets like the US. There's also, I think, a lack of knowledge around climate change risks, and in particular around fossil fuel. So there's still a knowledge gap that needs to be filled. And finally, I think there's still signs of hope because the broader dialogue, not specifically on fossil fuel, but around climate change risk is picking up. And people are talking about green bonds and selecting stocks taking into account climate change risks and low carbon strategies in the portfolio. So I think to summarize, I think perhaps divest, invest as a message for in the context in Hong Kong may be a little bit too progressive at this stage, but maybe it has to be tweaked a little bit. But the way that we want to tell our community is between total divestment of fossil fuels and taking no action, there's actually a whole range of things that you can do in between. And hopefully we can see more development here in Hong Kong and as well as in Asia going forwards. So with that, I will hand over the next session to John McKinnon.
Can everyone hear me?
Great. Yes, we were just hoping you were there, and so please take it away.
Okay, so I've been asked to speak about an example of an impact investment we made in through a faith-based organisation. So the Currawing Christian community is a little Aboriginal community outside Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. It's about 30 households, I understand. It's an ex-Christian Reform mission that is now essentially run by has its own association and board. It's a very functional Indigenous community as far as they go. It has a waiting list of people to get in. It's a dry community, and appears to be one of the healthier ones around. But they pay a lot of money for their electricity. They are connected to the grid, but they're paying over 40 cents a kilowatt hour. A volunteer with the Alternative Technology Association from Kalgoorlie got to know this community and thought up a bit of a proposal for them to have some solar. In a way, it was technically quite easy for this community because they have a single meter to the grid, and all the houses are sort of behind the meter, and they just pay their electricity bills via their rent. So technically, it was a very simple solution to put solar wherever we could in the community, because it was all behind the grid. So this volunteer had this plan, and then the ATA approached me saying, here's this interesting idea. Now we're after funding. And I think initially they were looking for grants to fund this. I looked at it and said that's an eminently investable proposal. They can easily pay back a loan plus still save a lot of money, so everyone can be ahead. And we explored that. It took quite a while to get it across the line because they went off exploring grants, as people do. And eventually I discovered that no one was going to give them any money, so they came back to us, and we put together basically two foundations, up from one other, went halves in a loan to them. We got some pro bono legal work to put together the loan agreement. Kylie Charlton at Australian Impact Investments did a lot of the sort of, I suppose, negotiating on exactly how that would work. It's only quite a small project, so the total loan was only 50-something thousand. It ended up being quite small, but we saw it as a pilot of the sort of things that could happen. And so that took, installation was earlier this year, in May this year, and the So they started repaying the loan basically as soon as it installed in June, and so far everyone's very happy with the way it's working. They're getting much cheaper electricity and they're better off financially. We're getting loan repayments. The interest rate was a fairly commercial interest rate. I think it's working out around about the 8% mark. We do have security over the solar panels for what that's worth, but I don't intend to drive to Kalgoorlie and pull them off a roof if worse comes to worse. But so far everyone's happy, and I think it's a great example of what can be done with a bit of looking around, a bit of imagination. I know it's only a very small deal, but the scope must be there to replicate this for much bigger deals.
Well, thanks, John. So I think we can probably move on to Thea. Are there any questions for John? If not, Thea, perhaps if you could tell us about the ARRCC approach. And we're just waiting for Thea to come on. And Thea, I think we can probably hear you now. Yeah, are you there? Perhaps you have your microphone muted.
Thea, it's Rob here. I've unmuted you. You might be muted at your own end on your own muting device.
Yeah, well, I think while we're waiting for Thea, perhaps Warren, are you ready to tell us about the case study that you were involved with?
Yeah, I could step in if you want to.
I think that would be great because we're having a bit of trouble getting Thea online.
Okay, all right. We'll go from the specific back out to the general then. So,
yes, just tell us, exactly who you are, what your organisation is, and exactly what you've been doing. That'd be really great.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Warren Bird. I am the Executive Director of Uniting Financial Services, which is the Treasury and Investments arm of the Uniting Church New South Wales and ACT Synod. I've been in that role for the last couple of years. Most of what I'm about to talk about took place before I joined the firm, but we've continued the journey, and we're now sort of getting towards the point where we're starting to be able to think about positive things rather than just the negative of divesting. But I'll talk about the divestment journey that the church has been on. It's rooted in the fact that for many, many years the Uniting Church's ethical investment policy has had a clear statement about the environment being an important ethical issue, and that harm to the environment was regarded in a negative way under the principles for ethical investment. But at the Synod meeting in April 2013, there was a much more explicit discussion and decision made in relation to fossil fuel extraction. And at that Synod, there was a decision that the church as a whole would prefer to invest in renewable energy stocks and avoid investing in fossil fuel extraction. And so they requested a group that we've had set up for many years called the Ethical Investment Monitoring Committee, which Uniting Financial Services and Uniting, which used to be called Uniting Care, are responsible for running. And so they requested that we have a look at whether this idea was practicable, and to come back to the standing committee of the Synod with some recommendations. So basically Uniting Financial Services undertook a lot of research over the next couple of months sought to define what is direct extraction of fossil fuels.
This? What's muted? Oh, I've pressed that.
Yes. Hello.
Sorry, Warren. Thea, if
I'll
you...
keep going.
Yes, we just need either Thea or Rob to mute Thea temporarily while Warren finishes up or continues. There's no rush, Warren.
Yep. Okay. So we were looking at how do we define what the problem is, what the issue is, and where what we're really trying to divest from. Understanding what the impact would be on our current investments. And having a look at a range of other issues such as how quickly should we implement any policy, and discussing with the underlying equity fund managers, what their views were and that sort of thing. Now, for us, all of our equity investments are undertaken by external managers, so it wasn't a question of looking at our own investment holdings. Our counterparts at Uniting Church Investments in Victoria do have direct investments, so they took a slightly different journey, but in New South Wales it was through discussion with external managers. Because in the Australian market that fossil fuel extraction is a pretty large exposure, the Ethical Investment Monitoring Committee recommended that the divestment strategy be staged over a period of 3 years. So the materiality level for ethical or unethical behaviour and activities in the policy is generally set at 5%, but to jump to 5% quickly would have meant basically selling down a third of the portfolio at that point in time. And the church decided that was a little bit too quick. So the policy, the methodology for implementing was staged that by October 2014, all stocks that had a net exposure of at least 40% from direct fossil fuel extraction would be exited. A year later, anything with 25% or more was to be exited. And then the third step was in October this year, where all stocks greater than 10% net exposure were to be exited. The managers were accordingly given those directions, and the particular stocks that fell under each of those measures was researched by Ethical Investments Committee in association with CARE, who provide some of our research, or most of our research on these issues. And each of those steps was met without too many problems, and in fact you look back on the timing of it, and our portfolios over the last few years have benefited enormously from having exited in that staged approach. The other step in the Synod's recommendation or decision was that we would instead invest in renewable energy. And the problem there was that under the Abbott government, the guidelines and the regulations weren't clarified well enough for a lot of really sound investments to get up and running at the time. Also, the economic fundamentals, the investment fundamentals of a lot of the projects and the opportunities were just simply didn't stack up. Things have improved since then, but this is going back 3 years, and so we ended up not actually implementing a lot of that positive side of things up until now, where we believe that opportunities are starting to emerge. So the current position for the Uniting Church is that the divestment policy has been fully implemented. We've actually gotten rid of that final 10% exposure side of things and just reduced it to 5% to align with the general definition in the ethical policy. We've been looking around applying, or making sure that we look at our whole portfolio, not just equities, because we're mostly invested in fixed income markets. So we've been looking there. We've had a few more opportunities on the positive side with the development of the green bond market to indirectly support the development of renewable energy projects through the banks and others who have issued into the green bond market, and that was a very welcome development from our point of view. We've looked at some other specific positive opportunities in the renewable space. Some of them, the projects look wonderful, but the investment structure that they've been put in doesn't suit our portfolio at this point in time, but we'll keep looking. So it's been a good journey for the church to go on. I think it'd be true to say that my predecessors in the investment team were a little bit wary of going down this track at the time, that they felt it was going to create far too much tracking error for the portfolio and that sort of thing. But I think experience and the development of the market and the fact that underlying managers are now becoming much more willing and able to run a portfolio that doesn't have the 28-30% or so that we've now excluded. They can do that, and they're quite comfortable, and integrating ESG is now something which is a little bit more mainstream than it was 3 or 4 years ago even. I might leave it at that. Happy to take questions.
Warren, we do have a question from Rebecca Wright, which was, was there a financial cost to undertaking this whole exercise? It's really great that you told us that your results have been really good, but what did the process itself cost the organisation?
I don't think anybody's ever actually sort of sat down and worked out how many hours the executive director at the time and the investment team spent on this. Obviously, April 2013 was when the Synod meeting was held, and we were back to the standing committee in October of that year, and that was when the new policy was agreed. So there was probably several weeks full-time equivalent of 3 or 4 senior people's time was spent on it. But I guess in our case, the Synod had said we want to be out of extraction of fossil fuels, so we didn't have to do a lot of work on that decision. That was given to us by the church. In a sense, the church as a whole didn't care what the financial implications were at the end. I mean, they asked if it was practicable, but it was pretty clear that even if it meant they were going to be exiting profitable investments, the ethical policy says we don't care. We don't want to profit from those activities. So the clarity of that decision and the motivation, I think, headed off a lot of time and effort at this organisation. But as I said, I wasn't here at the time, so I can't go into much more detail on that.
Yeah, no, look, that's
so
really...
I guess it wasn't an expensive exercise in that sense. It took people's time, but we didn't have to spend a lot of money on it, and it wasn't a painful process in the end.
Thanks a lot for that. That's really helpful. Now, can I just let all our listeners in know that we will have time for a couple of questions at the end if anyone has any. So please do.
It's Rob here. There's actually a question from Mark Copland for Warren, and he said, Warren, did this include investments in major banks?
Well, the major banks don't have the materiality problem. I mean, they do. I've been asked this question at Synod this year by a few people. Why do we invest in the banks? And basically, although some of them have a lot of dollars exposed to the extraction of fossil fuels, in all cases it's less than 5% of their total book and their total revenue stream. And all of the banks rate really highly on other ESG credentials, and so we haven't seen the need at this stage to include the major banks in divestment. Certainly they're still held or can be held by our equity managers, If we, in terms of the practicability of a decision, we're a treasury operation. We have to deal with the four majors and invest in money market securities and the like, so it would be a rather more interesting outcome if we did have to come to the conclusion that we couldn't deal with one of the four major banks in Australia, but we don't feel we have to make that as a call just yet.
Thanks, Warren. Well, I think Thea, you're back with us, such that we can hear you. So
yeah, apologies for earlier technological difficulties. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, so zooming out to the big picture, if you could move to the next slide, Rob. There have been calls for divestment from fossil fuels from the faith sector, but none so strong as at Marrakesh. If you go to the next slide, Rob. At Marrakesh, that was the most high-profile interfaith call to date for fossil fuel divestment and for positive investment in climate solutions. And it was signed by over 300 religious leaders, including obviously very high profile, the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Monsignor Marcelo Sorondo, and the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Saeed M. Saeed, who's from the Islamic Society of North America, and Rowan Williams. So, and it was accompanied by the first Muslim announcement, an announcement by the Islamic Society of North America that it would divest, and two constituent organisations would divest from fossil fuels, and they would be encouraging 5 affiliated institutions to do that as well. So that was very exciting. Unfortunately, we haven't had a call yet from Pope Francis in favour of divestment, although in Laudato Si there were quite a few teachings that collectively you could put together and say, well, it points to divestment, but he didn't come out quite as explicitly as this interfaith call about a month ago. So the next slide, please. Rob. So in the Global Divest Invest 2016 report, which is coming out today, the sector has witnessed a 140% increase in the last year in divestment commitments. It was one of the first in the history of divestment. We kept hearing the faith sector was a driver in it, and they're now continuing to perform strongly. Actually, the real figure is likely to be higher because of the tendency of some organisations to prefer to keep decisions quiet. I know at least 6 Catholic religious orders who do not want to make a public announcement, but have in fact made decisions to divest and also to positively invest in clean technologies. So the faith sector is a bit different in that they don't respond well to outside pressure or conflict, or pressure that would publicly embarrass them. So there's a heavy reliance on inside track work and on a consensus among the people who are making decisions, and that's partly because the faith-based institutions are not just organisations, they're also spiritual homes for people. So there is less tolerance of, they're more conflict averse. So things have to go through conversations and bringing everybody on board. You keep hearing that term. People all have to be brought on board. They're more responsive to the ethical case for action, although a lot of organisations still are concerned of maximising returns because they don't have a lot of money to actually carry out their mission. So they do care about returns, but you know, will be more prepared to let that go if there's a strong ethical case. They also often lack a certain amount of resources or capacity to implement decisions. So they, you know, they may not have the knowledge base or, you know, very high level expertise. So that makes them more reluctant to commit because they know they're going to have to pay or buy in expertise, yeah, just to implement decisions. So they're the big, I think, differences with other parts of the finance sector. Next slide, please, Rob. So you've had a case example from the guide from Warren Bird, but the rest of the guide is very similar to the Foundations guide that Lou O'Halloran talked you through. There's a section on the ethical case for divesting from fossil fuels and then investing in low carbon solutions. There's the global context, the historical context, and then there are guidelines for organisations considering fossil fuel divestment and for positive investment. So there's similar guidelines, you know. People need to do research, so there are videos recommended, and there are tools like the carbonizer.co, sort of researching how much exposure you do have, and then discussing options, committing, the third step. So that involves policy formation, deciding, you know, a resolution or the exact phrasing of the commitment, and then taking action. Do we need further help from other fund managers? How do we implement these decisions? And then finally, reporting and reviewing. So in the Faith Guide, just as in the Foundations Guide, there are well, in this case we have 3 case studies, and there are a whole bunch of resources that have been very generously put together by very knowledgeable people that would help people in the faith sector to actually implement the decisions. So yeah, that's the presentation.
Well, thank you, Thea. Rob, do we have any other questions? And listeners, do we have any? If you have anything, now is the time to ask.
None have come through, Thea, but we've still got quite a significant number of people who are, I'm sure, on the line still, and I'm sure we can squeeze a couple of questions out there while we've got such an impressive panel. Please feel free to put them in the questions box or the chat box, and I'll read them out loud.
Perhaps while people are doing that, I'll just start with my sort of wrap-up section. It's Sue back again. And look, the first thing to say is thank you so much to Max Horster and South Pole for hosting this session. The technology is absolutely marvellous, even though we all of us, I think, have struggled at different moments. And Rob Asselman, thank you for your practical organisation. It's been really fantastic. I really want to also thank, as I did earlier, Rebecca Wright, who really has turned well, my and a lot of other people's good intentions into reality. It's all very well to say, oh, that'd be a great idea, but we've managed, and Rebecca has managed to shepherd through a conference, the development of these guides, and indeed this webinar. And look, all the speakers, you've been really focused and really comprehensive, and I think it's really been incredibly useful. I'd like to congratulate everyone who really has moved with this, and particularly to thank the people who've put so much work into presenting these case studies for us. That's you know, Katie and Warren today, and all the others, because it, you know, understanding and hearing other people's experience is such an important part of being able to imagine yourself doing something. And if you'll be able to listen back to the detail if there are things that you would like to hear again.
There is a question here from Julia Lesky. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's just wanting to confirm that the slides will, whether the slides will be available after. Sorry, I misread that question. She's actually asking if the Divest Invest guides will be shared afterwards. I believe that is the case. Sue, did you want to confirm that?
Yes, absolutely. They're available on the AEGN site, I believe, and most importantly on www.divestinvest.org.au. We are looking at setting up, we're making a permanent home for Divest Invest Australia to become an Australian arm of Divest Invest US and Divest Invest Europe. These organisations are, you know, really growing from strength to strength all around the world, and we're going to be able to announce the release of these guides as part of the global announcement that is due to be made in just a few hours, as I was mentioning before. So, you know, we'd really encourage you to follow up on and you know, find out the detail of that big announcement that's going to be made. The 2016 release of the figures and the trends in divestment and investment, divesting from the problems and investing in the solutions. And I think these things are relevant not just to philanthropy and to the faith groups, but to the local government, to superannuation funds, to universities. And we should remember that this movement really started in universities when students in the US began to pressure their university authorities to get out of fossil fuels and try and become part of the solution. Someone raised earlier that.
Could I just mention that the guide for faith-based organisations will be on the ARC website, which is www.arrcc.org.au.
Fantastic. Thank you, Fia.
Could I just ask one question, I guess, as convener's prerogative, and perhaps I'll open it up to Max to begin with, is if we fast forward in this environment 5 years from now, and I'm speaking specifically about the divestment side of things, not the climate change side of things specifically, where do you see that we will be, and who do you see that will be the leaders and the laggards? I'm not sure if Max is still there. Otherwise, I'll open it up to the others.
I am. This is Max. I'm happy to take this one, but I would be interested to hear from the others as well. So it seems to me that there is a certain geographic divide. So it seems to me that there are certain areas, geographies that are further advanced than others, and I count Australia into those that are more advanced and where we see more happening. We see a lot happening in the Nordics, in the northern European countries, and we see a lot of movement in those countries where climate change is very much at the forefront of people's mind, of individual of the individual. So certainly the Netherlands, France now with a legislational push. And I personally also see still some opportunities in pockets in the United States, also maybe in a counter-reaction to the elections there.
Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I think there'll be a big surgence of divestment decisions in the Catholic Church, is my prediction, over the next couple of years.
This is Lou here. Can I be heard?
Yes.
I think my feeling about this.
Brad, we're getting some feedback with you, Lou.
Is that still happening?
That's fine, Lou. Just push through there. We can hear you.
Okay. No more feedback. Look, I think that's a really good question. No, the feedback's still happening. Okay. Because the markets are changing and the value of fossil fuels, we've seen such declines in the United States. We start to see glimpses of this in various parts of the world, and I suppose it's a little bit like. I'm not going to.
No, I'm sorry. There is a bit too much feedback there. We did try. Sorry about that, Lou.
I think the basic message is that things are moving really fast. The numbers are growing by the day, which is incredibly exciting and incredibly important because, as I'm sure everyone knows, we have no time to lose in dealing with climate change. So really encourage everybody to read the guides, step-by-step advice and the resources. You can listen back, as we said, to today's programs, and you can listen to Stephen Heinz, or you can watch an interview with Stephen Heinz on how Rockefeller Brothers did it. Also a fairly step-by-step process on the AEGN website. Perhaps if, Rob, I think we have a closing slide that has some of the...
Actually, it's Warren Bird here. Can I chip in on that last question just before we finish?
Please do, Warren, please.
I think we might be surprised at how much action we actually see within some of the companies that are currently the companies we're divesting from. I might be being a little bit optimistic, but I'm hopeful that companies like AGL actually turn their words into action, and that sets in train other people doing things. I mean, the history of companies is full of organisations that completely redefine themselves over time. I mean, the classic example I often give is CSR, which used to stand for the Colonial Sugar Refinery, but has nothing to do with sugar these days. So companies can change, and I think the divestment side of things is having a big impact, but we should never also lose sight of engagement and encouraging other companies to divest themselves and move in a new direction. So hopefully that's the surprising thing we see in another 5 years' time.
And let's hope that includes the big four banks in Australia, as somebody raised those as an issue, and it is absolutely critical that we maximise the pressure on those banks to get out of fossil fuel lending.
Yeah, I think some of them, they're trying to move in that direction, but they've got a lot of other stakeholders that they've got to get over the line first. But I know people within the banks that are pushing in that way, like Catherine Tapley at ANZ and others. So, yeah, let's cheer them on.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place for us to wind up. So thank you, everybody. Use the guides. The printed copies will be available early next year. Just get in touch at one of those email addresses, and we can send you a printed copy. But of course, the online versions, you can download a version before then. So thanks very much to everybody. Thanks to all our speakers, and thanks to everybody for attending as listeners.